Hello everybody. Hello. Let's see if this is going to work now. As always, we have to start by seeing how long the audio delay is, because I have absolutely no idea. Can you just write 1 to 3 in the chat as soon as you hear this? One to 3, that's not too bad. I think we can work with this. So welcome to the stream everybody. Today we're going to be reviewing some of your Vivariums, mostly poison dart frog Vivariums, but also Vivariums housing other animals. So it's going to be really fun. I did this once last year and I also turned that into 2 different videos. I'm not sure if I'm going to turn it into videos this time around because those videos did quite poorly, but the stream itself was really fun and I think it was a great experience to learn from each other's setups and see different ways that you can keep poison dart frogs. So I don't think there is that much else to say before we get into it. Let's just see if we can bring out the slideshow. Last year I had quite a slow system for doing this live stream, but this year I have sped things up by making a slideshow instead of opening up every single image and having a 30-second break between them. But I think you will be able to see this presentation now. It should be working. So the first tank, feel free, those of you who are in the chat who have sent in Vivariums, feel free to make yourself known whenever your tank is being reviewed. And also you can feel free to spam some numbers of what you think about the tanks later on once we get to those. But I think the first tank, no, that was not the right button. It seems like everything's working. The first tank was sent in by Spiked Reptiles, who I have seen here in the chat, so I'm assuming you're watching right now. Most of the tanks that you will see today I was quite unfamiliar with and hadn't seen before, but this is one that I have followed since the start, because this one has been, we have been frequently updated about the build of this Vivarium on the Swedish Dart Frog and Vivarium forums and Facebook groups and so on. This one houses a couple of flying frogs, which I'm not... Rhacophorus rainwarti, I think. Black-webbed flying frog is a bit easier, as well as a couple of mosquito rasboras, which are some fish, I'm assuming, in the water feature. This tank has quite a unique background method, which is somewhat similar to the one that I did in my latest scape, because it's working because it's made out of make products, but this one is actually made entirely from make products, I believe. Both their fake concrete, which I didn't use, but also their color fix product, which I did use, even though I perhaps used it a bit incorrectly. That's a very long story. But this is a rather freshly planted tank, so it hasn't really grown in yet, which might affect the rating slightly, but in general I think we are starting off very strong. I haven't decided exactly how I'm going to rate them, but at least a scale on 1 to 10, and I was thinking of doing 5 points for animal utility, how good it is for the animals, and 5 points for pure aesthetics, but I might just scratch that and do scores out of 10 instead. And you can assume that if it's a high score, then it's good enough for the animals and it's only aesthetic wise. For the animal's sake, this is a very big tank. I'm sure there's nothing to complain about. Something that perhaps could also be mentioned is that there is a very fancy drip system inspired by Troy Goldberg's massive paludarium, I believe. I suppose Spiked Reptiles could correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, or in the chat. So it's a very large and well-made tank for the animals. Aesthetics wise, I think it's a bit too early to call it a 10 out of 10, because it's rather freshly planted. It still has many open empty areas, but I still think that it definitely deserves definitely a 9 out of 10 for the fancy background, even though it has a very long way to go before growing in. If it looks great but doesn't cater to the needs of the animal in question, it shouldn't pass. I do totally agree for the most part. If there's something that's like a tiny minus in the corner, then I might not drag down the entire rating, even though it will lose a few points. But in this case, this houses flying frogs and not dart frogs. If this was a dart frog tank, we would have had a different discussion about water features, which I don't think is really necessary right now in this case. But yeah, I suppose I don't think there were any tanks that were bad for the animals that were submitted. Maybe a couple, we'll see later down the line. But I think this is a great 9 out of 10 to start with. And this time I didn't ask all of you to send in all of your Instagram handles or whatever, unlike I did last time. But I do know about Spiked Reptile's YouTube channel, and you should definitely go and follow it. It doesn't really have too many long videos right now, but it's high quality content, and I believe he had some videos in the works. So open it up in a new tab and subscribe, and let's continue to the next tank. Here we have a different tank. I will just see really quickly if I can bring up the message, even though I don't think it said too much. Yeah, it just said what animals it housed, which I have also written down on the screen. This tank houses 3 Dendrobates leucomelas and a couple of mourning geckos. Dendrobates leucomelas is by far the most common frog that people have submitted vivariums for. I think we have like 5 leucomelas vivariums out of 18 submissions maybe, so it's quite a popular species apparently. Why did my light go out? I suppose the light is fine still. We're just going to have to live without light. I don't think you need to see me that well. Anyways. Okay, back to the tank. I think we are keeping up a very high level of the tanks today. This one has a very special background. I'm not entirely sure what material this is made of. I wouldn't be surprised if it's like the Ben's Jungle clay that you can just stick on the back wall or something. Maybe latex peat, I have no clue. If whoever sent this is in the chat, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I think I'm just going to move on. But besides the background, I think this is a really nice tank with a very varied plant selection. I will have many comments about plants in tanks throughout today's live stream, but in this one I think it's a very solid tank for sure. You can see the nice Philodendron verrucosum as well as a couple of smaller leaved plants on the walls as well. I'm not sure about the size, but it definitely looks like it's quite big. Maybe it's the 60 by 45 by 90 centimeter Exoterra or something like that. It could be the 45-60. But I think that's too small. I think it's the bigger size. I'm not entirely sure what to say about this one. It's a very nice looking tank, and I don't really have any immediate complaints at all, really. It does look very yellow, which is probably because the verrucosum isn't looking the greenest right now, which is very easy. It's very easy to end up in that situation because Philodendron verrucosum tends to get very pale leaves under bright light. I've had it go this color in many cases myself. But in general, I think the whole tank has kind of a yellow vibe, which is a bit funny. But it does have a nice background, nice leaf litter, many leaves in different sizes. So I think this is also a very solid tank. Maybe it's a 7.5 or something. I will also have to say that there are many amazing tanks this year. I did a live stream like this a year ago, and the level was very high back then as well, and there were some excellent tanks. But I think I will almost have to give all the scores slightly lower now, so that there will be an actual variation, because I can't just give 7s and 8s to everything. I will have to also give out some 6s and some 5s. So for that reason, maybe the scores will be slightly lower in this version. I'm not entirely sure. But I think this is a very solid tank. I don't I don't really have too much to comment on. So I suppose 7.5 is pretty good. That's not what I meant to press. Let's see if we can find the third one. Yes, this person sent multiple Vivariums, and not just this one. But this tank houses dart frogs, and that's basically all that I know. Well, I did get a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I did get a list of 11 dart frog species that this person kept, and then pictures of like 5 different tanks, so I'm not entirely sure on which tanks house which frogs, but at least all of these tanks house dart frogs. So this is the first one, and most likely the prettiest one that we're going to review and give a score. But we also have these two, and I'm going to disable my face cam really quickly, like this, so you can see the entire Vivariums. Otherwise, I don't think there were any specific comments from this person, so we're just going to review the Vivariums simply based on these pictures, like it should be. Here I am back, and let's go back to the previous tank. Once again, this is an excellent tank, and once I was starting off going through all of these submissions to put them together for this live stream, I was very, I wouldn't say I was surprised by how good they all were, but they were really nice, and I was really quite impressed. Especially this one, I really like how you managed to get the lush vibe, which is sometimes kind of difficult to get. Oftentimes you will either have a bunch of large leaves, or you will have it so that all the plants are like straight against the background or something like that, and it's kind of hard to get the lush sense of foliage that you would feel in the rainforest and might want to replicate or something like that. But in this tank you've managed to do that really well. It really feels like a forest, basically. And I also like how almost half the bottom part of this tank is completely dark, it would seem, which is great because here the frogs can feel secure, and that actually, while it adds areas where the frogs cannot be seen, it also means that they will be more likely to be brave enough to come out of there, since they always know that they can retreat into the back parts of the Vivarium. If I have to find something to complain about, maybe there isn't any leaf litter here, I'm not entirely sure. It feels like some perlite substrate, which is somewhat similar to the pumice substrate that I use in many of my tanks, but I'm not entirely sure or convinced. Maybe some leaf litter could be added, but I think that's a fairly minor complaint, and especially because this Vivarium might house arboreal dart frog species. This person did keep a few different Ranitomeas, and in that case, while it's still relevant, it might not be as crucial. I think this tank deserves a very high score. It's lush and green and beautiful, so let me know in the chat what you think, but I personally think this is another 9. I was going to give it an 8, but that's too low. I think this is a really excellent tank, and I love the vibe of it. So I think we're handing out the second 9 out of 10, and we're only 3 submissions in. And I'm only going to review 1 tank for each of the people who sent in multiple tanks, so I will only do this one, I think. But these 2 tanks are also really nice looking, even though I definitely prefer the first one, which looks like it's also the biggest. But let's move on to the 4th submission. And here we have an interesting one, which I might have more to comment on, since this was a person who was new to the hobby and wanted some feedback and advice, while the previous 2 were, or the previous 3 were excellent tanks that were clearly built by people who really know what they're doing. But this one sent a message which says, "Hello, I've been looking to get into keeping dart frogs and have built a vivarium. It's my first attempt at making a false background. I was thinking of housing a pair of Aroid or Anthonii, though I have not made the jump yet as I'm concerned this is too small. Feedback welcome." So for a first tank, you're really starting off great. I can't really see any of the super common beginner mistakes that a lot of people make, like not having enough leaf litter or having too much ventilation or anything along those lines. It seems like you have avoided some of those easy, what can we say, not fallacies, but easy places where you can go wrong. In terms of choosing a dart frog to keep in here, I think it wouldn't be a problem at all to keep Aroid or Anthonii in a 45 centimeter cube, and a pair would be good, but of the Anthonii, I would even say that you could house more than a pair, like 3 or 4 in this size wouldn't be an issue in my opinion. They can go in the quite small tanks. But if you want some feedback on the content in the tank, I think the plant choices are the main thing that I would change. As Abel points out in the chat, I definitely agree that this bromeliad is highly likely to die. So I suppose there is a beginner mistake here, but at least the major ones which are hard to fix were definitely avoided. Bromeliads typically tend to do best when they're planted above the ground, and if they're planted in moist soil, they can survive in some cases, but it's not always that likely. This plant, I'm assuming, is some kind of Calathea. I'm not sure about the exact species, but this is a genus of plants which I would personally avoid putting in dart frog tanks. Not because it's dangerous to them or unsuitable for the environment or anything like that, but because they get very large leaves while they're kind of difficult to trim down. Let's say you have something like golden pothos, or in this case there are some philodendron scandens, and this might be golden pothos, I believe. When those plants grow big, you can simply make a cut because they are growing on a very long stem, and then you cut off a few leaves and it will keep growing. But these plants that kind of grow from one solid base, for instance these ones, also alocasias, typically tend to outgrow tanks a bit faster, and they're also a bit more difficult to trim in a way that it will look nice afterwards, because you're kind of you keep trimming off the biggest leaves. Instead of like a golden pothos, you would just cut off a few leaves and it would grow others new to the side. I'm not sure if that makes sense or if it was the clearest explanation, but in general it's a plant that will quickly outgrow your tank and is a bit more difficult to trim down than many other plants that I would prefer using. And my final comment that I was going to leave about the plants for this tank is regarding the size of leaves. And this is also something that I will talk about a lot when it comes to the tanks here today. Because there are many plants with quite large leaves in this tank, which I personally think are all very important, of course. But something I'm lacking is more nice small leaves that will kind of start covering the background. There is this one plant here, which I cannot for the life of me remember the name of, but it's there. But it's not exactly the one that will cover the whole background and make the entire tank lush. Maybe it will if you leave it for 5 years, I don't really know. But besides that, there aren't really any of the tiny plants, and I would definitely consider adding a few of those. If you just want to make a lush and green jungle, I think Ficus pumila is a very nice example. Also Ficus pumila quercifolia. In my case, I tend to avoid those because I want slightly more slower growing plants, so I opt for different Markravia species instead. But I think some smaller leaves would really elevate the setup, because it will give it another whole sense of perspective in a different way, because if you just have massive leaves, then the entire tank will kind of look small. while if you have many small leaves you get the opposite effect, and I think that's the key to making a lush rainforest. We do have the creator of this tank in the chat, so welcome to the stream. I hope you enjoyed the feedback. But besides that, you have a very solid ground to start. There is a risk that this bromeliad will die, and that this Calathea, or maybe it's Gopetia now, I think they changed genus. Maybe this one will outgrow the tank and be difficult to trim. But besides that, like, there's a nice background. It seems like you have the humidity dialed in and so on. So I think you have a potential to make a really nice looking tank out of this. And I would personally add some more small leaved plants and move this bromeliad up from the substrate. So if we're going to give this one a score, I think maybe a 6 out of 10 for now or something like that. As I said, I have to give lower scores this year than I did last year, because I just kept giving like 7 and 8s to everything. So I think it's a bit more difficult to score these tanks now. But it seems like the tank has everything that you need for the frogs, and I'm sure that a pair of Aroidus or maybe even a small group of Anthonii would definitely love it. After talking for so long about that tank, I realized I forgot to show the second slightly different angle of it, but it looks rather similar. And here you can also see maybe not the entire frog room, but at least the frog wall with some nice frog paintings on the wall. And apparently this tank houses a Pac-Man frog, which no offense towards Pac-Man frogs, but I think you're going to have a lot more fun with an active dart frog. But who knows, I've never actually kept a Pac-Man frog, I just think they seem kind of boring. We have a question in the chat before continuing to the next one. Do you recommend exoterras for keeping dart frogs, or am I better off with something custom made? I would say that there are basically 2 common options when it comes to the vivarium for dart frogs, or technically 3. One of which I personally despise, which is to use an old aquarium, because I think top opening tanks are just really annoying in every single way possible. The other 2 ways are either an exoterra or a so-called Euro-style tank, which is another common way to build a glass tank, which basically has a strip of ventilation at the top of the tank and also some ventilation, some flat horizontal ventilation at the front of the tank. I could actually show you some, because I do have some behind me. Give me a second. So this is what you would call a Euro-style tank, because you can see it has some flat ventilation here at the front, and also a strip of ventilation at the top, which is barely visible here. These were some tarantula enclosures, which I did actually build myself, but you can use the same variation for dart frogs, which I do have in at least these 3 tanks here in the corner. I would say that Euro-style tanks are the prettiest, because the ventilation in the front is flat, which makes it so that you can see the entire ground level of the tank and you can see your frogs better. But exoterras work too. While I went on a long rant about Euro-style tanks, I think that's one of the best options. They typically have sliding glass doors as well, which I could have said. But the other option is to simply use an exoterra. They do have the ventilation like this instead, so it will kind of block off the view of the lower levels of the tank in many cases, which I kind of dislike. And the elephant in the room is that exoterras have a full mesh top, which you really don't want, because it cannot contain humidity whatsoever. However, it's really easy to cover up the top. You can get 2 pieces of glass and a tiny strip of ventilation as well at the top, and simply attach it with silicone. Takes 5 minutes, and you can just order the glass in the correct size from I don't know what the English name for glassmaster is. We say glassmaster in Swedish, but at any place which is cutting glass. Also a comment here in the chat about the sliding glass doors of Eurostyle being better than the swinging doors of Exoterra. I would say that I agree in most cases, though there is kind of an overlap in the middle. My favorite solution is what I have behind me, which is one sliding glass door, which goes off to the side, so there's no overlap in the middle. But yeah, sliding glass doors are pretty nice. That was like a 5-minute tangent on a single question. But your options are aquariums, which I personally despise, Eurostyle tanks, which I think are really good, and Exoterras, which can be really good as long as you modify the top of your tank. And if you want to see how to modify that top, I did a video about my video Vivarium Rebirth Part 4, which I do show you how to do that. Blue Collar Keeper, I did get your submission, and I even added it to the slideshow before the stream, so it's definitely in. I will also take a break once I've got through all the 19 submissions, I think. I will go through a very short break, like 3 minutes, and add any submissions that were sent in during the live stream. So it's still not too late to submit your Vivariums for review. But now it's time to move on. Finally, it's been quite a while. And here we have a Vivarium that houses some Dendrobatus auratus. So here you can see the entire tank. I believe they said it was an 18-inch cube, which is 45 centimeters. For those of you who use the metric system. For those of you who don't, my sincerest apologies. And this person also said, "Hello, I'm a first-time dart frog owner from Northern California. My first frogs are Dendrobatus auratus. Working on a 4 foot by 2 foot by 3 foot to upgrade them, hoping to breed them." Which is lovely to hear, because that's a massive tank and your frogs will be very happy in that. I'm certain of that. And here we have a third picture of the tank as well. So I was thinking of a few things about this tank that I would just comment on quite briefly. I believe the moss is something that looks like you've sourced it from outside and not from any Vivarium shop or anything like that, which can sometimes work, but at least here on the left wall it kind of looks like a thick mess which the frogs can sometimes have troubles climbing, but it should be good. Personally, I might add a bit more leaf litter to it, so a bit more of the ground will be covered up, so the frogs don't always sit in wet and soaked moss, but I think it should be fine. It's still better than having dead moss or something like that. I have 2 aesthetic problems with this tank, which is not something that the frogs would care about, though I care about it. The first one is really personal, and people will definitely disagree with me about this, but I think that variegated plants kind of don't fit into Vivariums. Which, as I've said, if you like variegated plants in your tanks, then amazing. But it will drag down the score in my Vivarium review, because I say whatever I want on this channel. Personally, I tend to like keeping mostly green plants, or at least black and red plants, which still look kind of natural. But I think all the white and pink plants that look out natural, I tend to keep them in some different place than in my Vivariums. But that's a very personal take. And I also think the background method you've done is kind of interesting. Because here it looks like you have uncured, or not uncured, you have cured expanding foam, which you haven't really treated in any way. Just put expanding foam and let it expand and call it a day. But in this corner it's kind of cut in a weird way, which doesn't really look too natural. It's kind of one straight cut here. So I can't really say that I entirely understand the background of this tank. And if it was my personal tank, I would probably definitely take out the variegated plant. I guess it's a philodendron white princess or something. I'm not entirely sure. I would probably take that one out personally, even though it's not that big of a problem. Before I was talking about how alocasias were kind of bad in vivariums because they grow too big, but I think alocasia black velvet is an exception to that. They stay rather small, so that should be totally fine. Just as a side note, I will complain about other alocasias later in the video though. But personally I would kind of lower the level of moss that's sourced outside if I were you, but it's not that big of a problem. So if we're going to give this one a rating, I guess like a 6 might be applicable here, which is mostly dragged down kind of by the excessive amount of moss for the animal's sake, and also the fact that the moss is so thick and can you say unorganized. It doesn't really look too natural, at least on this side. And obviously I think the background looks rather strange when it's cut here but not really here, so for that reason I think I'm going to give it maybe a 5.5 for now, but for the animals definitely seem happy. I mean, it's definitely a nice tank for 4 juvenile Dendrobates auratus. Like, these aren't big frogs. You could keep it in half the vivarium size once they are juveniles, and I wouldn't complain. For adults, I think this is, and for adults, I think it would even be fine then. So there's not really much to complain about for the animal's sake, but aesthetics-wise, I can't really give it too high of a score. So I think personally, 5.5 for now will suffice for this one. But now it's time for the next tank. And by the way, lovely to hear that you're upgrading them to a 4 foot by 2 foot by 3 foot. Maybe you have some plans to expand the group or something, but if you don't, you will have a bunch of fun watching your 4 frogs in a massive paradise. So feel free to submit some pictures of that tank next year once I do this live stream again. We have a question in the chat. Hi, I use a lot of terrestrial moss on my tank understory. Should I remove them and replace with leaf litter, or can I just add leaf litter on top of the moss? I think in many cases it's possible to kind of like semi-cover it up, though the parts of the moss that gets covered up might actually die off. I personally think that as long as you don't use a bunch of dead moss, like a bunch of sphagnum in a layer on top of your whole tank, you should be fine, because when you use a bunch of dead moss, then that will break down into mud basically, and sitting in such a wet environment can cause infections and so on for your frogs, which is of course not optimal. And in that sense, I think live moss is better than dead moss in every way possible, but I still like to keep maybe 50-50 of the tank covered up in leaf litter or something like that. In one of my tanks, which I'm looking at right now, I actually have a different solution, because among the moss I have a bunch of Peperomia and Marginella growing, so it looks like it's moss all over the ground, but in fact it's just leaves which actually stay completely dry, which the frogs really appreciate. But to answer your question, I think you should be fine just adding some moss on top of it. Should most likely work. But if you have a bunch of living moss in the back and add moss on top of that, or add leaf litter on top of that, maybe it's fun to take it out instead and propagate it, so you won't just kill a bunch of nice looking moss for no reason. Hi, I just submitted my 3 tanks. I'm not entirely sure if I got those, but maybe if I reload the page I will. I will take in viewer submissions that were sent in during the live stream at the end of the stream. And to answer your question about how do you submit your moss, I would personally... Whoa. I don't know what I'm saying. There is no personal way to submit your tanks. I was thinking about the previous questions. You can submit your tanks by sending them to the email address which is in the live stream description, and I will have a look at it at the end of the stream. How do you use aquatic moss in your vivariums or a moss slurry? I think when you use moss slurry, you usually use aquarium moss in the moss slurry, though I'm not entirely sure. It's called... I'm just double checking this one. 2 vivariums and 1 terrarium. Oh, you didn't submit it recently. In that case, I probably got it. I think I know which one you are talking about. Yeah, I think you got those. I think I got those tanks and they will appear throughout like the middle of the stream or something. But back to the moss question. I usually use aquatic moss, but I don't actually do the moss slurry, which is, I believe, when you mix living moss and dead sphagnum to retain the moisture better. But I typically use aquarium moss, which I simply put in a moist place, and if you make sure to keep it wet all the time for the first, like, I don't know, first 3 weeks or so, then it will typically establish itself, and it will work basically. So I don't personally use the moss slurry, even though it seems like a great option for those who have tried it. But yeah, I talk a bit about the moss in my video, in my 4th part of my series Vivarium Rebirth, which you can check out. But I basically just put aquarium moss in places that constantly stay moist, and I make sure that it stays moist for the first few weeks, and then it will simply live. But now I think it's time to move on to the next one. Hello, Mecky Darts. I'm doing really well right now. Here we have one of the most amazing tanks that were sent in. This one is rather large. You get kind of unsure when you see the strange measurements of it, but it's 80 by 50 by 80 centimeters. I can't convert that to inches off the top of my head, but you can Google if you really want to. And it houses Dendrobates tinctorius assyrius, Ranitmea amazonica aurana blanca, as well as a couple of geckos, Gonatodes vittatus. In many cases, mixing Dartrog species is a controversial topic, and whenever I mention it, I basically have to bring up a disclaimer that it shouldn't be done if you don't know what you're doing, and blah blah blah. I have an entire video dedicated to mixing Dartrog species, if you are curious about the topic, but basically, it can go wrong in many different cases. I think this mix sounds like one that's very likely to work out, especially in a tall tank like this, and I've heard many people successfully keep Dendrobates tinctorius with Ranitmea amazonica, but don't just try mixing random Dartrog species, because there are many things that go wrong, in case there are any beginners watching this, which I think there most likely is. But this is a big tank, and these two species typically can cohabitate. But back to what I'm supposed to talk about, which is how beautiful this tank is, because this is a really amazing tank. Once again, I talked about the lushness factor a bit before, and I think this tank pulled it off in perhaps the best way out of any of the tanks that were submitted today, because you see a bunch of small leaves. For instance, this plant, which I'm not entirely sure about the name of. We also have the Solanum species Ecuador, maybe, and a bunch of different ferns on this side. Ferns are just really awesome, and various other plants with really small leaves. So just imagine if all of these tiny leaves that really get a sense of depth and perspective to the tank. If you imagine that all of these plants were leaves were replaced by leaves that were maybe like 5 centimeters long or something like that, then the tank would look much smaller, and it wouldn't really look as lush and airy, and airy might not be the right word, but you can just feel the forest in this one in a beautiful way, and the ferns are excellent for this, as well as whatever this small leaved plant here in the corner is. I think I had multiple pictures of this one, though it was only slightly different angles, as you can see here. And it also said in the message that this is the vivarium of my son and I. We have it for almost a year and we're having a lot of fun with it, which is awesome to see, or awesome to hear, because you have an excellent start to the hobby here. And well, there's not really anything negative to say. You can see that some of these Begonia Schultze leaves are starting to get a bit red, which is they sometimes do when, I'm not sure if it's too much light or if it's nutrient deficiency, but I've kept this species in the past and the leaves kind of go red. But in a way it kind of matches with the bromeliad, which is supposed to be red, as well as the Begonia amphioxus. So that's not even the one plant that's not doing well here. Even that is hard to comment on. So yeah, I think this is a really excellent tank. This angle is also a really good one to take a photo of, though it might look slightly different from different angles. I'm close to giving this one a 10 out of 10, to be honest. Maybe it's at least a 9.5. But I think this one is a 10. Now the misting system is going on. I don't know if you can hear the noise in the background. It was a very short mist, so it doesn't really matter. I think this is a 10 out of 10, to be honest, because the lushness, the sense of lushness is just so amazing in this tank. So let's simply move on to the next one, I suppose. What the heck is the... Okay, doesn't matter. I just saw something really strange on my stream overlay. Here we have the next Vivarium, which houses some Dendrobates leucomelas. And this is also a tank from somebody who was new to the hobby, if I remember correctly. So welcome to the Dartrog world. You will never get out of it, I suppose. I will just check if I received previous tank. Yeah, so this one houses a couple of Dendrobates leucomelas. I believe it was 4 of them. I'm not sure about the exact tank size. It might actually be in smaller range, but it could also be a misleading picture because I'm not actually sure about how big it is. Though I think there's definitely room to consider upgrading this to something slightly bigger in the future at some point. I have a few comments about this one. One of them is the lack of leaf litter, because while there are a lot of leaves in here, there's also a bunch of exposed substrate, which once the frogs walk on it, it will kind of get stuck to the frogs. In this picture, they are quite clean because they are in the water dish, but you can imagine that a bunch of this substrate will kind of get stuck on the frogs, which isn't really optimal. They kind of think it's fairly annoying. And I do also have a few comments about the plant choices, which are partially on the aesthetic side, and also in terms of how to quickly create a nice lush rainforest. So the golden pothos, I think it's a great plant to use in most cases in any tanks, because it contributes with a couple of large or medium-sized leaves, which but I do also think that the smaller leaves are very important, and you have the nice Ficus pumila in here, which I'm going to tell a bunch of people to get for their tanks today in this review. However, it seems like it's planted here at the top, and at least personally I think I tend to be most successful with Ficus pumila once I plant it on the ground and let it grow up against the background, both because it looks a bit more natural and because it will simply grow much faster. It gets more water and can just grow more. So personally I would try to plant more Ficus pumila on the ground. As you can see here, that's what they have done a little bit. It wouldn't surprise me at all if all of this died and this tiny cutting here placed on the ground would simply take over the whole tank. That wouldn't really surprise me. But it's a great choice of plant if you really want to cover up the whole background fairly quickly. And we do also have, I think this, it's not a peace lily, it's something else. I don't know what they're called. Spider plant in English. Cyclosternum cosomum, I don't know. This is also a plant that I think is difficult to trim in a good way once it outgrows the tank, because they tend to grow really quickly and really well, and in some cases a bit too well. And unlike the golden pothos, where you can simply cut off a stem with a few leaves, this one is very difficult to trim once it gets massive and starts pushing the top of the tank and so on. And they also get really huge root systems. So I think personally I would take that one out before it gets large and takes up too much space, and replace it with some plant that's, what can you say, more, I'm lacking a word here. What was I gonna say? More common in a dart frog tank, basically, because these spider plants tend to get a bit too big in most cases, and they're difficult to trim down or remove in a good way later on. So personally I would replace that one, and I think you're going to have more success with the Ficus pumila planted on the ground rather than up top. But besides that, you have a pretty good start. It might be in the smaller range, I'm not entirely sure. So for now I think I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10, but I think if the Ficus pumila takes off and you get a really lush jungle, then it can be a very nice looking tank. Thank you for the nice words, Moodlish. I really appreciate that. Let's find out what the next submission has in store for us. This is another excellent and really beautiful tank. Unfortunately, this one was sent in as a video, and the slideshow that I'm using in the background, I couldn't put a video in that, so unfortunately you will have to live with this screenshot. But this is another one of those really lush jungle type tanks, and it really or showcases how you might not always need to put too much effort into your background. I'm not sure if this person did put a lot of effort into their background, because the plants have covered up the whole thing, and you cannot see it. So my mindset whenever I make a tank with, for instance, a hygrolon attached straight to glass as my background, which is not the prettiest, then I imagine that a few years down the line it might look like this, and then the background doesn't matter at all. That was just a tangent about backgrounds, but yeah, this is an amazing jungle, and it looks very natural, and it's quite overgrown. This is not somebody who likes to trim their tanks too often. I really love these massive ferns that you have growing. Oh, that was not what I meant to do. I really love these massive ferns that you have growing. Whatever species it is, ferns in dart frog tanks can often be difficult because either they die or they get far too big far too quickly, and they're kind of like, they also kind of belong to the category of plants which are a bit difficult to trim. You can actually see they have been trimming off a few of these stems right here. I'm not sure how visible that is. But ferns can be tricky, but once you have a species like this, it really looks beautiful and makes the tank look like a jungle. So this tank houses a pair of Dendrobates tinctorius acireus, and I believe they said it was 1 meter by 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters long, so basically 3 foot or 3 feet long, for only a pair of acireus, which is awesome to hear, because those frogs are living their best lives, not some overpopulated or overcrowded tank. They just have a bunch of space to roam around and have fun. So I think this tank also deserves a very good score. I can't exactly... it's not the prettiest picture, of course, which I kind of take the blame for because I wasn't able to show you the video and I just had to grab the best screenshots that I could find. But what do we say about this one? It's at least an 8. I'm willing to give it an 8.5, or I think an 8.5, because I can't really see it too well from this camera quality. And honestly, if you had a shot straight from the front with better camera quality, then the score might have been higher. But it's kind of difficult to tell. But I think this is a truly amazing tank, and you did an excellent job with it. I would be very curious to know how long you've spent on this tank. So I'm giving it an 8.5 for now, because the competition today is really quite high. And you can even see Off Alone is giving it a 10 out of 10 in the chat. So yeah, very nicely done. Hats off to you. But now it's time to move on to the next tank, which I accidentally spoiled a bit before. Or actually, we have a question first. If I make the background in the Vivarium from expanding foam and then pour coconut fiber and dried sphagnum moss, is it okay? You will need something to attach the coconut fiber and dried sphagnum moss with, because if you simply try to squeeze it into the foam, that won't really hold too well. I personally haven't made a foam background in years. I tried once to use styrofoam and silicone and coconut fiber, and I really didn't like working with it. So I'm honestly the wrong person to ask. But what you usually do is you take expanding foam, you cut off the top layer of the expanding foam, because the top layer is like very shiny and stuff doesn't really attach to it. And then you attach silicone and some and then you put coconut fiber on top of the silicone. The sphagnum moss usually falls off, so I wouldn't even put it there in the first place, most likely. But anyways, it's time to move on to the next tank, which I have 2 pictures of taken at quite different points in time. So here you can see the first picture, which I'm assuming is when it was kind of freshly planted, because on the next picture it's much more grown in, so I will keep this picture open because it's a little bit more lush, we can say. So this one houses 5 Dendrobates leucomelas, and it was apparently set up in June of 2024. So it's not super old, but as you can see, these plants are already starting to grow quite well. This is a very Aroid-heavy tank. Aroids are a family of plants consisting of, for instance, philodendron, monstera. I was gonna say Adansonia, but that's a monstera, that's not a different genus. Philodendron, monstera, alocasia, and so on. And it's one of my favorite plant families, at least. And I also like to use a bunch of aroids in my tank. In fact, I can only see 2 different plants in this tank that aren't aroids. Anthurium as well, can't forget those. It's one of the best genuses there are. I can only see 2 plants in here which aren't aroids, and that's this bromeliad, whatever it is, and I remember we had this plant in last year's Vivarium review, but I don't actually remember the name of it. Solanum oleanum, I think. Maybe, I'm not sure. I can only see those 2 plants which aren't aroids, which is quite funny, and moss of course, but it doesn't really count. If I were to change something in this tank, I think it would be to add a bunch more non-aroids, perhaps a couple of Margravias that could cover up the wall a bit, because as I have discussed on basically every single tank, I'm like a broken record and I get back to the same points every single time, I feel like. I think with a bunch of tiny leaves you could make this an even more lush jungle type of setup. So imagine having a bunch of Margravias, maybe some Peperomia and Marginella. I think you could get a much better sense of depth in the tank. Something that I would like to point out, which I also really like doing in my tanks whenever I have the opportunity, is the fact that you've used multiple big plants of the same species. I believe there are 3 different Philodendron bilietiae it could be some strange hybrid like Billietiae atabapoense hybrid or something. But these 3 plants are the same. And I think this is quite a fun way to plant your tanks, because even though you might not want an entirely monocultural tank, I also think it looks very natural, like it would in nature, where you have a single plant that's kind of abundant in a certain area. Because it does look quite strange if you just have 1 plant of this species, 1 plant of this species, 1 plant of this species, and so on. So by having multiple different plants of the same one, it kind of looks a bit more believable. Like, it's like we're in the Philodendron Billietiae jungle, which I really appreciate. But I think if I were to change something, I would most likely add a couple of more small-leaved plants. Peperomia and Marginella could be a fun one. Markgravias are always fun. I tell a bunch of new Dartrog keepers to put Ficus pumila in their tanks, but if you really love collecting different plants, then it might not be that great, because they can take over and suffocate all of your nicer, more rare plants. And I think, judging by the plants that this person have used, I'm assuming they might not appreciate Ficus pumila as much as somebody who just wants a green tank would. But that's of course difficult to say. So to rate this one, the competition today is really tough, and despite saying that I would hand out much lower scores today, I don't know, man. Like, I think this is also at least an 8. Given the lack of small plants, which... Oh, that was not what I meant to do. Given the lack of tiny plants, which makes it so that the tank doesn't really have as much perspective, I think that drags it down a notch to an 8 or so. But I think this tank, like, it's a big tank, which is also kind of a freebie for a high rating, because it's kind of difficult to make a big tank ugly. But I'm definitely willing to give it an 8 out of 10. And if you had a bit more varied, a slightly more varied plant selection, not just aroids, I think it can definitely increase the ranks slightly more than that. It could definitely become a 10 out of 10 in the future if it's really grown in and nice. But what do you use for the background, and how do you attach the cork to it? Yeah, usually people take cork and they attach it straight to the glass with silicone, and sometimes you use some kind of tool, maybe a drill bit or something, to scratch up the surface of it, because you don't want it to be so even and flat. But it's just, yeah. What is the substrate? Great question, which I don't think this person is here to answer. I don't think the person was here in chat. Or maybe it was just a question to me or anyone else. Substrate is a long story, and I cover it in most of my videos whenever I make a Dartrog setup or something along those lines. So I'm not going to spend 5 minutes talking about it here, I think, unfortunately. But the substrate in this tank, I really have no clue what it is. Now it's time for the next Vivarium, which houses some Hyalinobatrachium species, or glass frogs, which is very fun to see. These are obviously not dart frogs, so there's no need to scream about the water feature in the chat. These frogs are tree frogs. Looks like no drainage on that one, which could be a problem in the long run. I think that was a comment about the previous tank. I would say that I think there is most likely drainage in here, and that it could be two different layers. I'm not entirely sure, but I would guess that there are 2 different layers, but it's simply so dark that you can't tell them apart, or possibly that it's filter foam, in which case you don't really need any drainage. So it could be a risk, but I'm not sure that there is an issue, so I'm not going to drag down the score for that. But back to the tank that I was currently reviewing, which was this one for 3 glass frogs. It's very fun to see some variability, not just a bunch of dart frog tanks. And in fact, I have been considering getting into glass frogs because I think they are really awesome frogs. That's mine. Is it? Which one is it? That's yours. Is it? It's this glass frog tank, I believe. Very fun to see some glass frogs represented here, at least. It has drainage. I think the drainage comment was about the previous tank, which was not yours, but I'm not entirely certain. I'm just assuming that they have proper drainage, unless I can for sure say that the tanks don't, so I'm not going to lower any scores from that. But yeah, the glass frog tank here. It's a nice looking tank. Once again, it's kind of the same comment as the previous one, because there are a bunch of aroids with large leaves, and also a bunch of exposed hygralon, which I also have a bunch of exposed hygralon in my tanks right now because it takes a while to get it covered. But I think some nice small leaved plants climbing up the hygralon would definitely elevate the setup a bit. You do have some, I guess this is some kind of Ficus pumila here in the back, and obviously some ferns here as well, whatever this is. So there are definitely plants with leaves of different sizes here, but I think you could probably add some more small leaved plants, especially if you put some climbing plant here on the ground that will climb up the wall. I think that would probably increase the score slightly, but besides that, I think it's a really nice looking tank again. The competition is very high this year. Not that it's a competition, but all the tanks are really excellent so far, at least. I'm really happy to see all of these different ones. There, I actually had multiple pictures. Maybe I should show you those before, or well, this is just the same picture but a bit bigger. And I was just gonna move my face cam a bit so you could see it. But it was also an entirely different tank submitted, which houses Reniculated Sirensis quimpicari. Kind of a small but practical thumbnail breeding tank. As with all the people who submitted multiple tanks today, I'm only going to review one tank for each person, and I think the big one is the more fun one to review, for obvious reasons. But it's a very nice natural looking build. It has a nice water feature in the middle here. The glass frogs obviously like a bunch of large leaves where they can sit as well, which they do have. I would add more small leaved plants, and probably add plants here on the ground which will cover up, climb up against the wall eventually. But yeah, besides that, really nice looking tank. I would say basically the same. It's very similar to the previous one, because both of them have a bunch of large leaves. They are large tanks with a bunch of potential, and I made the exact same comment about both of them. So perhaps I should also give them the exact same score and give this one an 8 out of 10 for now. I think should be good. And as I said, I'm not going to review the second one too deeply, although it's a nice and practical thumbnail breeding tank. It looks like the mesh top here on the Exoterra is covered up with a piece of glass, which is great to see, to maintain the humidity. But this seems more like a practical tank than a display tank in many ways. Here we have a different tank though, and this is definitely one of the more unique submissions, perhaps not because of the plant choices or anything, but because it's a Millspo cabinet, which I think is just a cabinet from IKEA out of glass, which you can convert into a vivarium with a bit of time, love and care. It's not something that I've looked into doing myself, but I know that many people have, and if you're having fun with it, then that's amazing, of course. So I think the message said that this tank was about 150 centimeters tall or something like that, which I'm sure the frogs really appreciate. And here was also a second picture. I believe it was only 2 pictures of this tank. Yeah, right. The same person also sent in a picture of a gecko tank housing Tropical Lotus nateri. But so it's fun to see a different tank as well, but I'm going to put most of my focus into this big one for now. This one seems to be rather freshly planted, so but it really does have a nice plant selection with leaves of a bunch of different sizes. I don't have to keep going on about leaf sizes as a broken record again and again, because there are plenty of small-leaved plants in here that will most likely cover up the walls eventually. The ground is very empty here, but the person actually said in their message that more plants will be added to the ground level very soon. Or maybe it even said that they had added more plants since taking these pictures, which is great to hear. But yeah, I think there's not really that much to complain about. On the other hand, the tank is quite young and it seems like it has some growing in to do. I haven't even mentioned the inhabitants, but you can see on the screen I had written it down as Epipodobates anthonii, so not really too much to say about those. Is there really anything more that I have to say about this tank? Not really. I think this will look really awesome in a year and a half from now, and it's looking great right now as well. The background is some kind of cork bark, cocoa fiber, something like that, which looks great. We have the creator of the tank in the chat as well. It's 177 centimeters by 70 centimeters by 35 centimeters, so it's even more than 100 it's even more than 1.5 meters. It's a very tall tank, and it's fun to hear that the Epipodobates anthonii utilize all the height, which was also mentioned in the message. I feel like I'm getting tired now. And you also mentioned that the tank has a drip wall, which as long as those features last, sometimes they do run a risk of kind of saturating the substrate, but once again, I'm just going to assume that it's set up in a sustainable way. But you can kind of see water dripping down on this this side. But I think this is a great start for a tank. One just spontaneous thought that I had was that cork bark and a bunch of moisture, in this case from the drip wall, can result in the cork bark breaking down and falling apart within only a couple of years if it constantly stays moist. So maybe by turning off the drip wall you could get a few more years of lifespan from this background, but who knows. I haven't actually tried having a drip wall on cork bark myself. I just know that cork bark really easily falls apart if it's constantly moist. But yeah, once again, for the third time, I don't really think I have too much else to say about this one. For now, it's probably a third 8 out of 10 in a row for now. I think that's a pretty suitable score, and it's fun to see people taking on the challenge of converting a Millspo cabinet. I don't think I would. I'm also curious how tight or how escape proof it is if you have to do some extra stuff to make it escape proof, because I could imagine that frogs could easily get out of such a setup, though I'm not sure, so I will leave it up to you to answer that in the chat. But for now, I think we're moving on to the next tank. And once again, nice little desert gecko setup here, but I'm not going to focus too much on that one. Here we have a second glass frog tank, and another one of my favorite tanks among the submissions that were here today. This one houses Hyalinobatrachium valoroi, which is the glass frog species that I have considered, definitely consider getting into my collection in the future, because they are so beautiful and it seems like a fun species to keep and to learn a bit about. But this is a nice looking tank. Something that does It wasn't too hard to make escape. A comment in the chat about the previous tank. It wasn't too hard to escape proof. Just added some weather stripping to all the gaps around the doors. Well, sounds reasonable, I suppose. Who knows, maybe I'll get a Millspo cabinet in the future. I think I'll stick to the easier tanks, but kudos to all of you who put effort into converting those. But anyways, something that does confuse me a bit about this tank is that these are the two pictures I got. And on this second one, it really looks like the entire ground level is filled with water. And on this first one, it's all substrate and leaf litter. So I'm not sure if they were taken at different points in time so that the water was taken out and it was filled up with substrate later on. Once again, these are glass frogs and not dart frogs. If a dart frog tank had 100% water on the bottom, it would get a 0 out of 10. But this is a glass frog tank, and I think water on the ground is perfectly reasonable. We have the creator of the tank in the chat, so please enlighten me about the removal of the water feature, if that's the case. I'm also very curious, since, as I mentioned, I have considered getting some glass frogs at some point in the future. So if there's any reason that you had to fill in the water feature, I would love to know about that. I changed the bottom from water to land for breeding season. Okay, will you change it back to water later? I would assume it was the opposite way, that they need water during the breeding season, but who knows really. What is the plant with? Yeah, I think the creator of the chat will answer that for you, Moodlish. But I was talking about a bunch about the water feature in this tank. Well, there are so many other things to look at. This is also the same tank once it was being constructed, and you can see the background method. Oh, that was a different tank. You can see the background method, which is using a bunch of cork bark panels and kind of squeezing in sphagnum moss in between, which is a rather unique method, which I have seen a bit of recently and might consider trying in the future. But I think this is an excellent tank, and especially this shot is really beautiful. I think it honestly looks more beautiful with dark substrate, because like this it was kind of lighting it all up from beneath, which looked a bit strange. But it looks really amazing like this. I put in lava rocks and leaf litter when giving them a break in breeding. Okay, that sounds a lot more reasonable. Still, like, respect for just putting in and out all of that substrate. But yeah, I only have great things to say about this tank. I was just talking about bunch of uncoherent stuff about the water feature, but it's an awesome looking tank. Looks really lush, and it looks kind of complete in a way. Some of the previous tanks you've seen, like, it has to grow in for another year or so, or there's something that's just missing, but this one just feels complete. It feels whole in a way. So I think this is another 9 out of 10 personally. I guess the Varicosum isn't really doing too well in here, but when is it ever really doing too well in a tank? I think this is a 9 out of 10. I'm considering giving it an even higher, but I can't give it higher than the one that got 9.5 earlier. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at 9 out of 10 and not dwell on it anymore. So I think it's time to move on to the next tank. Excellent job, Rens. Here we have a tank for some which will house mossy frogs in the future, though it doesn't house anything yet as far as I'm aware. Once again, we have a tank with a bunch of water at the bottom, And it seems like some... It's not cork bark background. Is it tree fern? I'm not entirely sure. But it's a nice looking tank with a bunch of cork bark and branches. I would assume with such high moisture that it won't take too long before some of those branches start to break, since this tank kind of feels like not a wet chamber, but kind of, I suppose. But you have a nice hardscape layout, and it said in the message that a lot more green will be added eventually, which the tank might need, because right now it looks a bit more yellow with all of this kind of dead moss. But once that dead moss gets covered up with living moss, then those mossy frogs are going to love it. I haven't personally kept any mossy frogs at any point, so I can't say too much about those, but I'm assuming that that this tank is going to be a nice one for them. But the tank definitely has a long way to go before it will look completely lush and beautiful. But if you get the right aquarium mosses, or even moss spores, but usually just buying a bunch of random mosses from aquarium shops and pet stores will work quite well. If you get the right aquarium mosses and place them in the right places in this tank, and then give them like a year to grow in, then you're gonna have a really amazing tank right there. So it's a big tank, which big tanks tend to get really high scores today, I'm noticing. Given that this one is kind of fresh and it hasn't really grown in that much, I'm not going to give it a too high score. So for now, I think 6.5 or 7 is reasonable. But it's a massive and amazing tank, and I'm sure it's definitely going to be like an 8 or 9 in the future once it's a bit more grown in and a bit more full. So time for the next tank. I believe we have the person who sent in this tank in the chat here today. This tank houses some Dendrobates leucomelas, and I got a question about the branches in the message, I believe. I'm just going to bring that up on my second or third screen. I have 3 screens up right now, which is not what I usually have. I have my Chromebook here off to the side. The person asked, said that they think the branches look poorly and bad to me, and wonder what I think about them. I don't really agree. I think this big floating branch here, as long as it's situated in a stable way, I think that has potential for a really nice looking tank, because you can have a bunch of epiphytes planted here and kind of have a bunch of shadows here on the ground, which you already do, but once it's grown in, it will be a lot more. Once you have such a dark ground level, the frogs will be able to feel secure in a very nice way. So I wouldn't change too much about the branches at all. Maybe add a few more. Who knows, the people who are super artistic and care so much about the alignment of the branches, maybe they would care more than I do, but personally I think this is a good start, and my philosophy is that the tanks will or the plants will simply take over, and by that point the branches in the background don't really matter too much. So I think you're doing good with the branches, and there's plenty of leaf litter here, and a nice plant selection. I don't know what this plant is, but I suppose it's a good plant for the environment. I think this tank probably needs more plants, but you say that it's a new tank, so I guess that's something that will come over time, because I don't really see how this tank will be completely grown in and filled in with the plants that you have at the moment. But it seems like if you say that the tank is new, I'm sure that it will grow in over time. But adding a few plants definitely wouldn't hurt. But I like the variation in leaf sizes and so on. But I believe that you had sent in multiple tanks, and this one was also from you. It said in the email green tree frog, and I'm assuming it's Dryophytus cinereus. But it could be some different green tree frog. You never know with the common names. This is probably the strangest frog tank that I have ever seen in my life. I have no clue what I'm looking at, if I'm going to be completely honest. And I would be lying if I said that this didn't raise any concerns. I mean, we're talking about an arboreal frog species, and I'm not sure if this seems more like something you would do for like a burrowing animal or something like that. I think I would prefer to just have an open conventional tank like you usually would for a tree frog. And I honestly have no clue how what this is holding the substrate up, and I would love if you could give me some insights into what it is that I'm looking at with this kind of hole in the middle. I'm not too convinced about this type of concept. I'm really sorry, but I think a normal arboreal open tank where the frogs can climb would be much better, because for arboreal animals you want as much height as possible, but doing it this way you're basically making it all a habitat below ground in a strange way, and I'm also not sure how happy the plants will be. But it's a fun concept, and I will give you the prize for the most unique frog tank that I've ever seen, for better or for worse. But I'm sure the frog is going to be fine. But I would absolutely consider building a more normal frog tank for it in the future, because it's not a burrowing animal, it's an arboreal one. And here we have the fourth picture, which wasn't actually a tank, but I got a question about how to do the background. So here we can see some expanding foam here, and you were asking how to apply the cocoa fiber. Once again, I have actually never even used expanding foam, and it's been years since I made a foam background with styrofoam, silicone and cocoa fiber. But what people usually do is that they take a razor blade or maybe a knife, and they cut off the outer layer of the foam because it's really shiny and the silicone won't really attach to it. So you cut off the outer layer so you get the kind of spongy surface. Then you smear silicone all over it, and then you put cocoa fiber on top of that silicone. I wouldn't try to mix up the silicone and the cocoa fiber first, because I think that would just be a mess. So that's the way that people normally make these kinds of backgrounds, and I think this is a nice ledge if you follow through with it, so the frogs can get a bit of shadow down here. But to get to the point, I'm not going to review this one, of course, since it's not even set up yet, and I don't think I'm going to review this one, even though I would absolutely consider getting a slightly more normal arboreal tank for the species. But I'm going to review this one. Obviously, once again, a freshly planted tank. I can't really give it too high of a score, especially not with the very high level of all the tanks today. Had you submitted it last year, I would have given it a higher score. But I think, once again, like a solid start. You add a bit more plants and you give them like 6 months to grow in, and I think you will have a nice looking jungle. But for now, I think 6 out of 10 or something along those lines will probably do. I personally don't think the branches look too weird. I mean, it is a little bit strange, but once again, my philosophy is that the plants will take over and nothing else will matter in life eventually. So I wouldn't really worry too much about that. And I think this having such a ledge over the ground level to get a bunch of shadows and stuff will be really nice for the frogs, especially once it's grown in. So let's move on to the next person. here we have this tank. I believe this person sent in 2 different tanks. So this tank was 7 months old, has no inhabitants so far. And the background was made out of 2 different types of wood, talawa wood and cork bark, which was attached to the glass. And then the rest of it was used with Ben's Jungle's background, which those of you who are overseas might not be aware of, but it's a German company which makes... It's kind of just mud that you attach to the glass some way. I haven't used it myself, but I have considered it. Looks pretty natural. It's just mud that you buy in a bucket and put on the background, and it will look good. I remember we had 1 tank last year in that Vivarium review, which utilized that strategy as well. Not really too much to say about this tank. It's lush and it's nice, and it's starting to grow in. It's, once again, it's kind of a yellow tank, like a bunch of, especially the Verrucosum leaves are kind of yellow, and maybe the light is also yellow. I'm not entirely sure. It's not really the lush green color, but I don't really know what makes some tanks yellow. Maybe it's partially like nutrient efficiency, could be lighting and so on. But I think it's a nice and lush jungle, kind of simple, but still effective in a way. Of course, it's not super simple. I also like to make really simple tanks and just let the plants take over, and it looks like they're on the track to do that. But I think the second tank you sent in was an even prettier one. Yes, it definitely was. Nothing wrong with the previous tank at all, but I think this is a really amazing tank. This one was 1.5 years old and houses a pair of Reticulated variabilis. And this one has a tree fern panel background, or xaxim as it's sometimes also known. This is a slightly more full tank, you could say, and once again this tank kind of feels full and complete in a way, like I said about some previous tank as well. I'm really impressed with, I'm assuming this is an orchid here on the back wall, and seeing such a massive orchid is not something super common. Maybe it's not an orchid, but I'm assuming it is. It really looks like one. But seeing such a massive and established specimen is quite impressive. And there's also some nice philodendron here. Some philodendron florida, I suppose. And the walls are all covered with Markgravias, which are my personal favorite wall covering plants if you want a tank with varied plant selection. And some nice epiphytes here on this wall as well, or not this wall, on this branch. Some nice orchids here as well. I guess this is like a Microsorum fern, Microsorum thailandicum or something. I'm not entirely sure, but I think this is an excellent tank. It's hard to review these tanks, all of them are so good. What do we say about this one? I still think it's an 8.5 because it feels complete in a way that the tanks that I gave 8s earlier, like this one and this one, they felt like they had many empty, like bald spots where it was lacking these small leaves, but this enclosure really doesn't have any bald spots at all. It has the very beautiful wall here with all the Markgravias, and it feels complete in a way. So I think this is an 8.5, maybe a 9. Let's say 8.75. We're really getting into the decimals here. Who knows, by the end of the video we're going to have like 5 decimals on every tank rating. And here was a different angle of the same tank. Once again, really beautiful tank, and really well done, I have to say. Oh, this is a Philodendron squamiferum because it has all of these fuzzy stems. I'm surprised it hasn't grown massively bigger, because squamiferum tends to get massive leaves down the line. They tend to get that. But now we have somebody else who was in chat earlier, at least. I believe this is the only person who sent in their Vivariums both last year and this year, which is Rare Fruit Collector on Instagram. This tank houses Epipedobedes anthonii highland, and I also got a second picture of a Dendrobates auratus green and black tank. We have a person in chat saying that the previous tank was a 9. I mean, I gave it as close as a 9 as possible, but I wanted some separation at least. Hello Abel, you're keeping up the streak. It's great to see. This is a Dendrobates auratus green and black tank. You can see the massive Monstera obliqua in here. I'm quite jealous of that because mine is not as large yet. I have 2, and they're kind of starting to almost size up a little bit, but this is just a massive Monstera obliqua here in the back. I also like your usage of a bunch of these tiny palms. Sometimes I hate like the I have to Google what these are named in English. Actually, I'm not gonna Google it because that will take too long time. But some of these kind of palms that you usually buy in like normal garden centers, I kind of hate them because they never look good in vivariums. Either they get too large or they die off completely. But these ones, succulents, you say in chat, these ones are. I think they look quite pretty, and I would love to know a bit more about how large they grow and how the possibilities to trim them are, but it seems a bit more sustainable in the long run to use these ones than to use like the super common. I can't think of the name. I still have to Google it. I can't get over this. Maybe I should have asked ChatGPT for a quick translation, but I think I can find it. Parlor palm in English was the one that I was referring to that I don't really like. I thought they had a more basic name, Camayadora elegans. I think they usually look a bit strange. That was just a long rant about one type of palm that I think usually doesn't really end up too well. But this looks like a more beautiful, both more beautiful, and I suppose it's more suitable for a Dartrog tank. And you say that it's found everywhere in the neotropics, which I guess is also a part of why I think it looks so nice to have it. So maybe I will have to get my hands on some of those at some point. I felt inspired right now. What you do have to practice until next time is to take better overview shots of your tanks. Like, come on, you have fruit fly cups standing in here, and it looks like the glass hasn't been cleaned in years. I don't know. Like, next year I'm expecting you to take out the front glass and take a full picture from the front. But that's, well, just kidding. But that could actually like improve the scores that these tanks get. We also got a shot of the whole frog room here for the first time, I think, with some propagation bins as well. But what do we give this one as a rating? I have to ask: is this cork bark, or is it like the cork elm? Is it cork bark or something else? Because it really looks like some other type of wood, which I don't remember the English name of, but I should know the English name of it because I'm making a video where I'm mentioning the English name of it. It is just normal cork. Okay, I thought it looked like another type of wood, which you will hear in my video next week, what I'm talking about. That was just complete ramble from me. Not really much consistency in that. I'm starting to get tired right now. What was I gonna say more about this tank? to give some rating to this one, then I don't remember what you got last year. I'm assuming you got like an 8 last year, and it's more grown in now than it was last year, so it should get a higher score. But given like the score inflation, maybe we still give it an 8. Nah, 8.5. I think 8.5 final offer. They are nice and grown in, but I can't even see the whole tank. Like maybe if I could see the whole tank, it would be different, but I'm not entirely sure. So I think an 8.5 is suitable. I guess that makes sense over with the rating deflation or inflation since last year. And now it's time for the next submission. It seems like you're getting some nice attention in the tank, which is well deserved, and I even put your Instagram handle here because I remember that from last year. So feel free to go and follow that if you want to see more of these tanks. We're getting closer to the end, but it's not actually the end, since there has been a bunch of submissions during the live stream as well. But I believe I have 2 more Vivariums to show you before going on a short break of maybe 5 minutes or so, and then going on to the new ones. But here we have submission number 17. These are 2 Vivariums which house a Crested Gecko to the left. You can even see the gecko here, and some morning geckos in the tank to the right. And this person would also like tips on some easy plants, because apparently they have a black thumb, it seems like. So where do I start? Regarding easy plants, it will take a while before I have time to do that, but at least this summer I will definitely do a new version of my video about planting dart frog vivariums, because that's a super old video with garbage audio quality. But in that video I will kind of mention like the plant sheet code for because for people that don't care about plants, I think the easiest way to go is just to get Ficus pumila, some medium-sized aroids which grow in a way so that it's easy to trim them. We'll be back to that in 2 seconds. But getting Ficus pumila, some medium-sized aroids like monsteras or philodendrons is kind of a recipe for success, and I think in this tank to the right at least, just putting some Ficus pumila in here and letting it grow wild would kind of solve all of your problems, because I don't think this is a background that you would mind covering up. In some cases, if you make like a super detailed background, or for that matter if you're into collecting super rare plants, then you might not want to cover up your whole background. But in this case I don't think this person would mind having a green plant covering the whole background and making it super lush and beautiful. So if you got some Ficus pumila, you would be very happy, I think. And as I mentioned a bit earlier in the stream, you tend to be most successful with Ficus pumila, in my experience, if you plant it on the ground, but you plant it kind of close to the background. So it will have its base on the ground, but it will still climb up against the wall on its own. Because the mistake that many people make is that they try to plant them epiphytically and they want them to hang down or whatever, but then they get planted in a way where it doesn't really stay moist enough, which isn't really optimal. So I think if you get some Ficus pumila, plant it on the ground. As long as you keep the tank humid enough, it's impossible to mess that up. Ficus pumila love moisture, but I think that's the most important thing. And for the tank to the left, I'm not sure about what plants could be added. You could of course still get the Ficus pumila, but this background might not be the perfect background for such a plant to climb up. But the one to the left in general, like, it has a pretty good plant selection. Some more plants wouldn't hurt, some more big ones. Maybe like a golden pothos or some other kind of pothos could fit in kind of well. I also have to talk a bit about the plants in this tank to the right. Because here we see one of the bigger alocasia species, and this is not a big vivarium. I believe it's 30 by 30 by 45 centimeter tank, which is 12 by 12 by 18 inches. And we see an alocasia and a calathea, which I believe are the two, do you say genuses or genre? The two genre of aroids, which are very difficult to trim in a good way once they grow, because they simply send out one leaf that's bigger than the previous one, and they kind of grow in a base instead of growing on a vine that you can just cut off. Instead, you will simply have to cut off the petiole, which is kind of awkward, I suppose. So trimming down alocasias and calatheas, or gopetias as they are now known, is kind of difficult in my experience, which is why I tend to avoid them. I think monsteras and philodendrons, and just in general any shingling plants, like any vines, typically tend to do a bit better. So maybe I would consider replacing those two, or just adding different plants as well, because you can count on having to trim those. But in general, I think what the tank to the right needs is a bunch of small-leaved plants, such as Ficus pumila, for instance, would probably make you very happy once that has taken off. And the one to the left, I'm not entirely sure what I would add, but I think some more medium-sized aroid could fit in at least. And you can try Ficus pumila in this tank as well. If you plant it in a good spot, it might start climbing around and so on. So to review one of these two tanks and give it a score, I believe the one to the left is the slightly like bigger and sophisticated one, so it's a bit more easy to review. I believe it's around the minimum size for a Crested Gecko, so it's not like a massive tank or anything like that. But you utilize the volume of the tank, which I think is super important, and a very common beginner that many people make. This isn't really as big of a thing if you're keeping like a terrestrial or even a semi-arboreal dart frog. But once you keep a Crested Gecko, which is just climbing all day long, I think it's super important to really fill it in with a bunch of branches, which you have managed to do. That's the most common negative comment I would have about a Crested Gecko or other gecko vivarium. So really good that you have all of these branches for animal utility. And aesthetics wise, I obviously can't give it a super high score aesthetics wise with the Exoterra background and some fairly basic plant choices, I would say. So maybe a 6 out of 10 would be suitable, but it seems like your gecko is happy. Like the enclosure is in the smaller range for a Crested Gecko, so maybe it could be a slightly higher score in a bigger tank, just in that sense. But you've managed to utilize the volume, which is great, and which is something that you very often have to, not something that you very often have to complain about, but something I would very often complain about for beginner Crested Gecko vivariums. So that's something that I really like. And easy plants, Ficus pumila, and any aroids which grow on a vine instead of growing like from a certain base, if that makes any sense. Like golden pothos, shingling monstera species, like Monstera adansonii, I think you already have that one in here, would probably make you very happy in life. And now we have, I believe this is the final submission before we go on a 5-minute break. This vivarium houses Ophaga histrionica tado, which is by far the most expensive frog that we have reviewed a vivarium for today. And we also got a picture of this little Ophaga, a very beautiful frog. And we also got a picture of a vivarium that was in the works for some Phyllobates terribilis mint. I'm assuming that both of these vivariums, that was a different tank. Actually, we have another submission before going on the break. but let's get to that later. I'm assuming that both of these tanks are very heavily inspired by Troy Goldberg, with the cork bark background with very heavily worked on, and all of these nice branches. You can see this is a bit more artsy background than I would usually make. I just throw in some branches so the plants can grow on something and you can get some more 3D elements, but here you can see all the branches are going in one direction, and so on. It kind of all makes sense. Yeah, I think this is an excellent looking tank. Both of these tanks are. This one is obviously more grown in. I'm not going to review this one that's in the works, but the background is really amazing. It also has this kind of yellow tint. I think this is just a light on the tank that's a bit yellow. I'm not entirely sure. And this bromeliad isn't exactly the happiest. Maybe it's staying a bit too wet. But it seems like it fills up the needs for the frogs well, and there's not really too much else to say. I think we have the creator of this tank in the chat here. I have a more modern picture of the tank that I will be planting it next week, which is great to hear. I'm assuming you're talking about that you will plant this one next week. So it sounds like you're making some progress. Well, I'm supposed to give a score as well. What do we give this one? I think it's still rather freshly planted, and maybe it could do with slightly more plant species, or at least more small ones, to fill in a bit more. It's not really, it doesn't have the same sense of being full in the same way that some previous tanks has. So maybe we're going to go for like a 7, maybe 7.5. I think a 7 out of 10 is reasonable for this one. But given a bunch of time, I'm sure that it will definitely rise the ranks a bit. You mentioned also in the chat that you replaced the lights with whiter lights, which I'm really just saying it as from an aesthetic point of view. I don't really think that it matters too much about the frogs. For the frogs, we usually say that they should have 6500 Kelvin light to resemble daylight, but I recently had the privilege to listen to a lecture about lighting in vivariums, where they were talking about how reptiles interpret light and how that really doesn't matter too much if it's 6500 or like 4000 Kelvin, but I still think that 4000 Kelvin looks really ugly, because it's completely yellow, and cold white light always looks the best. That was a very long tangent. I feel like I'm starting to lose my thread here, but I think a 7 out of 10 is reasonable now for this one. And for the next one, the scape is absolutely amazing, with these nice wood pieces all going in the same direction. It feels like it's telling a story in a way, if you will. But this tank, it seems like it has a bit more growing in to do. The light in the current picture is 5000 Kelvin. Yeah, I would assume it's something along those lines, and I can definitely imagine that it looks slightly nicer now. Needs moss. I'm assuming that the unplanted one needs moss, you say, because I think this one has a pretty healthy amount of moss. I personally avoid having like the whole ground covered in it. I think this is a very reasonable amount to have, because it's pretty, but it's not abundant, so the frogs still have some more dry places to sit in. I think a 7 out of 10 for now is perfectly reasonable. And it's now time to move on to what I think will be the last one before moving on. We have some comment about 18-inch cube yeah, I think that was just a discussion. I don't think I'll add too much to that discussion. Seems like it was resolved. Yeah, the unplanted one needed moss. I was a bit confused by that. Here we have the final submission. which was, I think, 3 Vivariums. And this first one housed Ranitmea variabilis southern, according to these labels at least. It's a rather simple tank with a hygralon background, but it has some really nice wood pieces. Like without these wood pieces, this tank wouldn't really be as much as it is with them, obviously. That was a weird way to say that these wood pieces look pretty good. And we have quite a few aroids in here. There's also Juvenile orchids and a couple of bromeliads, but once again, I think we mostly have aroids in this one. And I think a bit more small-leaved climbers, maybe even a bit of moss on the walls wouldn't hurt this tank at all. Given that you seem to have a nice plant collection started, I wouldn't really add Ficus pumila because it will invade everything, but a few more Markgravias might fit in to this tank, perhaps. And here we also have a different tank from the same person, housing Ranitmea reticulata. This is a very interesting tank because it looks like you have horizontal hygralon as on top of your substrate. I can only assume that this is like filter foam and you have simply covered the top of it in hygralon, which is something I've certainly never seen before, but perhaps it works, who knows. This tank looks rather empty. It seems like it houses Ranitmea reticulata, which is also a rather shy species, which loves very what can we say? A very lush and densely planted vivarium. So I think, of course, these plants are going to grow, but I think I would also add a few more plants to it so that the frogs can simply like get more coverage. So a couple of plants of various leaf sizes to this one added certainly wouldn't hurt. But I like the simplistic approach to the background. This is the same as I usually do, just hygralon straight at the glass. No need to make it more complicated than it has to be, because this will be covered with plants eventually anyways, so who cares really. But I think a few more plants would definitely spice up this tank a bit, because it's not really the lushest thing. But here we have the final tank from this same person, which houses Phyllobates terribilis orange. And I think this is the one that we're going to review. I'm going to review the prettiest from the people who sent in multiple. Like this one and this one, they're kind of tight, or like, I would say they're fairly equal in how pretty they are, but they are very different styles since this is a more terrestrial setup. Here we can see a nice Monstera obliqua here in the back, I'm assuming, and a really nice, is it like Philodendron linhanoniae? That's not how you pronounce that, but I tried at least. We have a nice Philodendron here at least with these nice, what do you call these leaves? There's a word for how they look. This kind of bulgy leaves. It's called something, I don't know. And we can of course see some nice frogs in here as well, and a nice looking hardscape. I'm not sure exactly what we should rate this one. Like, it's not filled with plants or anything, and a few of the plants aren't looking the happiest. I really like keeping the dead leaves on bromeliads because it kind of looks natural. But the scape itself is really nice, and I think with a few more plants this could be a really excellent setup. For now I think a 7 feels kind of reasonable. Yeah, I think this is pretty solid 7 out of 10, I'm assuming. And with that, it's time to go on a very short break, because I have 3 new submissions that were sent in during the live stream, which I'm really going to, or really quickly going to add to this slideshow, and then I will be back to you in approximately 4 minutes, I think. So see you very soon, and don't go anywhere. You can keep this tab open until you hear my voice again. Okay, I think we are back now. Hopefully you will be able to hear me once again. We now have the final few vivariums of this video that we're going to go through. 3 more were submitted during the live stream, and I will make a review out of those as well. So give me a second here. Here we have submission number 20, and this one was sent in by somebody who was fairly new to the hobby. This was his first Dartrog tank, set up about 5 months ago, and it houses a single Dendrobates tinctorius, a series, of course. Normally it is, at least. This tank looks fairly solid. I believe this is a cork bark background, but it kind of looks strange in some way. I don't know. It looks very natural and nice, at least. It seems like a fairly normal tank in most ways. The one thing that I will comment on is the size of it. Just judging by comparing it to the size of like the plant leaves, I think this looks like something really small. And since it only houses one Dendrobates tinctorius, and in that case, no worries at all. But for an adult Dendrobates tinctorius, I think a 45 centimeter cube or 18-inch cube is the minimum size, and I'm assuming you're most likely planning on upgrading it to that size eventually. And in that size, you could keep a single one or even a pair, in my opinion. So this isn't exactly a massive tank, and it definitely has to be upgraded, unless I'm completely misled by the perspective of this photo in some way. But yeah, and you were also asking about some tips on how to improve this tank. Most of my tips today have been regarding planting. In this one, while there are some very big plant species that might grow a lot in the future, I think that might be what you want in this tank. And there aren't any bad plant choices in this one at all. Like, these are all very suitable plants for vivariums, which are kind of easy to trim, even though I personally wouldn't use Ficus pumila and Tradescantia anymore because they grow a bit too quickly for my liking, since I like to collect a bunch of rare plants and so on. If you just want a lush green jungle, then they are really amazing. And I kind of want to get like one really big, or not big, but one like Ficus pumila tank where it's just completely overgrown, because it is a very nice and beautiful aesthetic. So honestly, I don't really have too much to comment on. Maybe a bit more leaf litter could be added. It seems like the old layer has started to decompose a bit. And once again, the size isn't optimal. I would guess this is 12 by 12 by 18 inches or 30 by 30 by 45 centimeter vivarium, which is fine for a juvenile or for a temporary enclosure, but definitely not large enough in the long run for a Dendrobates tinctorius. You can still keep the enclosure in the future for like future froglets or something along those lines. You will always need more tanks, of course. There's always a use for it. But I don't really think there's anything too major that I'm noticing I would improve. I'm not going to give it a too high score because like it's a fairly small tank and it has like solid plant choices. Not really anything major to complain about besides possibly the size, depending on the age of the frog and how long you'll keep it there for. But there's also really nothing too special. The background is nice, I think. Some cork bark, cocoa fiber, silicone mess back combination. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I think I'm going to give this one, give it a 5 for now, since it's fairly small. But if you set up an 18-inch cube that was set up in the same way as this, then it would definitely be higher than a 5 if it was set up and planted in a similar way. You do have a good point about hating pothos. But if you just want green plants and something for your frog tank, then it's difficult to go wrong with pothos, even though you can of course find more rare and slightly more exciting alternatives. But a part of me definitely agrees with you slightly on that. So I think this is a 5 out of 10 for now, and if you were to set up an 18-inch cube, or maybe an 18 by 18 by 24, 45 by 45 by 60 centimeter, if you were to set up one of those tanks in the same way as this one, then it would definitely get a higher score than a 5. But this is a fairly small tank still, so I'm not going to give it too high of a score. But a solid first build. Maybe refresh or replenish the leaf litter fairly soon, or something along those lines, and upgrade that frog at some point in the future. Next tank. Why did I switch? I was on the wrong screen. That's what I was supposed to do. This person sent in, I believe, 3 different enclosures, and we're going to go through all of them, but we will end up coming back to this one. This one houses Dendrobates auratus penna blanca. I don't think you can see any in the photos. But it also houses Phelsuma clemeri, or neon day gecko, which you can see one here at the top branch actually. A very beautiful gecko species, which can be kept together with dart frogs, given that they require UVB and so on. I think that it's not always optimal, since they need a slightly drier environment and kind of a basking spot, meaning that they can still be kept with dart frogs in a really large vivarium, but in small tanks it's not always too easy. But the vivarium seems kind of solid. One thing that I do notice is that the substrate is kind of a chunky and a little bit dirty mix. I'm assuming this is coconut husk mostly. And once you have such a substrate, I would like to cover it almost entirely with leaf litter, so that the frogs don't have to walk in the substrate and get it stuck onto them. But it's not really anything too major. And there's a nice cork background here. You've done a very good job on the texture to make it look a bit more natural than it looks when you get those corkbark panels, which are of course like completely perfect rectangles, which isn't really what you want mostly. So this one has a bit more nice structure. There are a bunch of misting nostrils on this one. What do you call it? I'm not sure the word, but there are a bunch of misting nostrils here on this in the same place, which is just interesting. I too keep clemeri and would be suspicious this should have more ventilation. More horizontal bamboo would be useful for the gecko as well. Yeah, I personally never kept day geckos, but I'm assuming that more bamboo would definitely fit in. And yeah, it's hard to tell exactly how much ventilation this is. I can imagine that having more ventilation might result in it getting even drier. And there is of course some nice front ventilation here, but who knows, maybe that's something that could be considered. More bamboo seems very reasonable from a Phelsuma keeper, but personally I haven't kept any Phelsuma, so I'm not going to say too much about that. You can see the dart frogs, but I would personally add a bit more leaf litter for that. I think there's room for more plants on this background. I can see some Ficus pumila quercifolia here, which might start growing a bit all over the place in the future, who knows. So maybe in a year or so this tank will be a bit more filled in, because it currently has room for a few more plants, I believe. But it's a solid tank, and I think a 7 out of 10 is perfectly reasonable for it. This person also sent in multiple tanks. They sent in this Dendrobates leucomelas vivarium, which they said was freshly planted, so I'm guessing that it will be much more grown in soon and more plants will be added over time. Is this hygrolon attached on top of corkbark panels? I'm assuming that's the case, but I feel like the corkbark panels are completely useless in that case. I mean, it does add a bit more 3D elements to the background, I suppose. But it's kind of like you're buying a nice looking background and just covering it up with something ugly. Like, I would rather have either just a hygralon with maybe like foam or something behind if you really don't want it to be completely flat. I don't know. If it works, it works. But it kind of feels like a waste of corkbark, if I'm being totally honest, in this case. Because I don't think that corkbark is the best way to put something behind the hygralon if you want it to look more natural and uneven. But there is, I really agree with your comment in the chat about this wood. Because I think this kind of fallen log vibe isn't too common, and maybe that's something that more people should try, because I actually really like the aesthetic, and there's also some nice moss growing on top of it, which seems to be doing well, which is always nice to see. So maybe if you have a wide and not very tall vivarium, maybe this fallen log is something to take some inspiration from. This tank housed Dendrobates leucomelas, but it was very freshly planted. I'm not sure about drainage in this tank. It's not hard to tell, but I'm just going to assume that you have it all fixed, or have it all in a suitable way. And then it was the final vivarium from this same person, which is a growout vivarium for Ophaga Pumilio bastimentos. Since this is a growout tank, it's something fairly small, but it has a nice background, and what else do you really need, if I'm being totally honest? So these were the 3 tanks. I only gave a score to this one, which got a 7 out of 10. I think it's a nice looking tank, and you have some good backgrounds here. I'm not too sure about this background. It's definitely a strange combination, but if it works, it works, and that's the important thing. I'm sure the plants will love it. And now we have the final submissions. I see now that I did get one more submission that I didn't actually have time to add. We'll get to that later. I think I will still have time to include it. But let's just take this one for now. And this one houses Ranitmea vancellinii. And this is the final tank that I was sent in. What I have to say, I will actually bring out the comments that was mentioned about this one as well. Hi, I've learned a lot from your channel and enjoyed a lot. I use a lot of live terrestrial and aquatic mosses. I would certainly appreciate your feedback. So this is a tank with a bunch of moss in it, which is always nice and beautiful. The one thing that comes to mind immediately when you have this kind of a bit more lush moss, if you know what I mean. This isn't like a short layer on top of something, but rather kind of thick and, what can you say, chunky moss growing on top of this background. What immediately comes to mind is a video of specifically Aroid-heavy vancellinii really struggling to climb such moss. I think I even showed that clip in my in-depth poison dart frog care guide. Because having a bit of moss always looks really nice, but if you have an excessive amount of it, I personally like to avoid having too much moss, and I like adding a bit of leaf litter to some places and so on, because I can imagine the frogs having quite a tough time climbing this moss. That said, I mean, you have a bunch of bromeliads in here, and there are clearly parts of the background where there isn't a bunch of moss. So I wouldn't exactly say that it's the end of the world or anything, but it was something that came to mind since it was actually specifically the same species, which is kind of funny, because well, there is a clip of Aroid-heavy Vanzolini struggling to climb this exact type of moss, and typically we usually say that dart frogs want dry feet and a wet back, because in the wild it's not like everything is. Somebody who has been in the tropics could probably give a better explanation of this than me, but what we do know is that it's not soaking wet moss everywhere. It's a bunch of dried leaf litter and other areas where the frogs can live. That said, there are of course many epiphyte branches covered in moss as well. So maybe I would slightly decrease the amount of moss. And we also see a comment in the chat that if this person can obtain tropical moss, it might look or grow better. And I might agree to some extent, because this type of chunky moss, I personally think that's kind of the worst kind you can have, since it is difficult to climb. And if you have something that grows more like flat against the surface, it might be slightly easier to manage. But in general, I think there's not really anything to... besides that, I think this is a really nice looking tank. It's lush and it's green, and there's plenty of room for the frogs to feel secure in here. And they have some nice bromeliads as well to reproduce in. So yeah, nice looking tank. I think for the excessive amount of moss, I can't really give it too high of a score. So maybe a 7 out of 10 would be reasonable for this one, or something like that, because it is a very beautiful tank. Yeah, I think a 7 out of 10 is perfectly reasonable. Now, that's technically kind of the last tank, but I did actually get one very last minute submission, which missed the deadline for submitting last minute, so it was like behind last minute. But I might still be able to bring it up. Let me just check that really quickly. If I can just screen share without leaking too much weird stuff. This isn't completely optimal, but I think it should work. Okay, give me a very short amount of time. 23. Okay, we have the shortest break in all of Vivarium review history to review the final tank. I'm not even going to write anything down yet on the screen, as I have on all of the others. Here we have it. This is the final tank, which houses some Phelsuma clemeri. So it was sent in just a minute ago, or fairly recently. But I think we still have time to review this one. This one obviously has a bunch of bamboo, and it definitely seems like it's created for the needs of the species, which I think you know more about than me, because once again, I haven't kept any day geckos. And I don't really think I will. If I would probably choose clemeri, but who knows. There's a bunch of bamboo in here, and also some philodendron burley marks, which is a very fast growing philodendron species. If you just want a large kind of bush with these medium-sized leaves, then it's a great option to choose. And also some, I'm assuming this is some kind of orchid propagations here in these pots. Of course, not the prettiest thing to just have plastic pots standing around, but whatever keeps your orchids alive, I suppose. Well, for the animal's sake, I'm assuming there's nothing to complain about. We can actually even have a look at all the temperatures in here. I don't think that says 61 Celsius, even though it kind of looks like it does. It kind of looks like it's a 1 and a C, but I'm hoping it's not. Was just trying to read all of the small details. But I think it's a practical tank. It's not like the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. So what do we give this one? Maybe like, I think a 7 is reasonable. We're on a very long 7 streak right now. Before we were on like an 8 streak, and now we're on a 7 streak. Yeah, a solid tank. I'm sure your geckos are happy in here, and that's of course what's most important. Plenty of bamboo and fun places. Plenty of fun to be had for those small geckos. And with that, I think that brings us to the end of this video, or this live stream. So for all of you who are watching right now, and also for all of you who might be rewatching in the future if you couldn't make it to the stream, that will be it from me. I'm not really too great at how to end the live stream, so well, I hope you have enjoyed this stream. For those of you who I've reviewed your Vivariums, feel free to write something in the comments if you're watching this afterwards, or plenty of you have of course written in the chat during the stream as well. Yeah, thank you for watching. I have one video on the making that will be out fairly soon, which is about how I made my 2 most recent Vivariums, which you did see in my collection tour. It's 2 fairly small Vivariums that will house thumbnail breeding frogs, or thumbnail frog breeding pairs. So that video should be out within a week, hopefully. I think, yeah, I should have that video out within a week, and then besides that, I don't think there will be too many uploads within the next 6 months, because of course after Christmas holidays school will start again, and then I will have to put time into that. But there will be more videos coming out this summer. So I hope you have enjoyed the stream, and if you did, give it a thumbs up. And there are plenty of videos to watch on my channel, but if you came to the stream, I'm assuming you already knew that, so that's not really news to you. And with that, I say thank you for watching. Have a nice day, and Happy New Year's, of course. And now it's time to see how long it takes me to find the end stream button after having this intro. I think it's right here, so have a nice day. I have to confirm it as well. Okay.